Today is May 31st. How do we recognize God's leaders? Let's find out together as we study Deuteronomy 16 to 18. Today, as we read through the Bible in a year, I'd like you to read Deuteronomy 16 to 18. Chapter 16 tells us how to celebrate the three pilgrimage festivals. Each one of these festivals is to be held in or near Jerusalem. We catch that in verse 16 when he says, on each of these occasions, all men must appear before the Lord your God at the place he chooses. But take an offering with you when you go. The three pilgrimage festivals are Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This happens in the spring and roughly coincides with the barley harvest. The second festival happens 7 weeks after the first harvesting of wheat. Now that took a considerable amount of time. And so 7 weeks in, they were not done with the harvest, but they were to stop and to have the festival of harvest. Then at the very end of the harvest, and this actually took place in the late fall after the new year, which in some Jewish calendars happened in early fall, the festival of shelters. This was a general harvest festival, the harvest of olives and figs and other plants, other nuts and whatever that was growing. The purpose of the festivals, there are two others, by the way. Pentecost, which occurs 50 days after Passover, and then the festival of the New Year, which would occur in early fall. And apparently at some point that was transitioned to 6 months into the year and happened midwinter. There are three purposes of each one of these festivals. First of all, they were communal. They were not meant to be done alone. They would be done with other Israelites. Secondly, there was always a great deal of rejoicing. There was singing. There were pilgrimages, processionals in many cases, and there was a great deal of dancing. They would rejoice when the festivals took place. And then thirdly, all of the festivals are theocentric. They all take place remembering what God has done for us. We come then to chapter 17. Actually at the end of chapter 16, starting in verse 18, we have 5 types of leaders that God appoints. 16:18 says, appoint judges and officials for yourselves from each of your tribes and all the towns the Lord your God is giving you. They must judge the people fairly. And from here until 17:13, he talks about how to solve cases. And what it boils down to is they're to apply God's law to specific cases. And if something comes up that they don't understand, they're to go to the temple, because the priest will consult God and God will speak and tell them what they need to do. Chapter 17, verse 14 begins, you're about to enter the land the Lord your God is giving you. When you take it over and settle there, you might think, we should select a king to rule over us like the other nations around us. And so God talks about what the king should look like. Now he says several things about what the king shouldn't do. Shouldn't marry many wives, shouldn't become rich, shouldn't build up horses, things that by the very first king, they began to do exactly these things. But what Moses says, verse 18, when he sits on the throne as king, he must copy for himself this body of instruction on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. He must always keep that copy with him and read it daily as long as he lives. The king is to govern by God's word. Chapter 18, verse 1. We have priests and Levites. God sets up priests and Levites. Verses 1 through 8. Look at verse 2. These people will have no land because the Lord himself, is their special possession, just as he promised them. And they are to minister according to God's word. Starting in verse 9 and through verse 14, this is what the people that God has called to himself are to be like. Look at verse 13. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. And then starting in verse 15 and running to the end of chapter 18. This is God's prophet. And the bottom line, the prophet is to speak God's word. So how do we recognize God's leaders? How do we know when a judge is a good guy? How do we know when a priest, a Levite, a king, a prophet is God's leader? It's when they follow God's word. That's the only criteria that we're given. They will blindly follow what God says. And they'll do it in every decision, every time they speak. How do we recognize God's leaders today? They follow God's word. Give time thanking the Lord for the leaders that he's placed over you. Look at them and see if they're actually following God's word. Like, follow, and subscribe to this devotional on whatever platform you use to listen to it. Send your questions to us at questions@becomehope.com. Tomorrow, we'll answer the question, what has God done for us?